Okay, welcome to the Happy by Mistake podcast, building an abundant mindset for life and business. In this podcast, I tackle common challenges and themes that come up in the coaching that I do with small business owners and entrepreneurs. And for the most part, I do that by having free flowing dialogue with an expert on the topic. Today, I have the great pleasure of welcoming a close friend and colleague, Nicolo Bernardi, to the podcast. Welcome, Nicolo.
Hey, Corey. Great to see you. Great to be here.
We are going to learn from Nicolo about the regulation of emotions from the perspective of a neuroscientist who is also, by the way, an organizational consultant and coach. In other words, we're going to ask him, how do we get better at controlling our emotions so we access those that serve us, not hinder us? And we're going to cover topics like the truth about the so-called reptilian brain, what emotions actually are and how we produce them. Most importantly, tools and techniques so we can, apply to better regulate our emotions. We might even dive into topics like dopamine addiction if we have time, and a big question that I'm interested in about whether we as humans actually have free will. Big questions, exciting questions, and I can't wait to dive into them. But before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about Nicolo. So he's a psychologist and an ICF certified coach with formal training and over a decade of experience in mindfulness. He is a PhD in cognitive neuroscience with many published papers. He's spoken at Harvard. He is the founder of the Fortitude Academy, where they specialize in helping entrepreneurs with their emotion regulation skills. Various other trainings include dialectical behavior therapy skills, brain spotting. We're going to have to talk about that one sometime. Social presencing theater, ULab with Otto Scharmer, and organizational development. A very impressive list, to say the least. Now, you once also told me, and I'm hoping I'm getting this right, that you are a recovering, I don't do emotion thanks kind of guy. Did I get that part right? Did I get that part right?
Okay. Yes. Oh, yes.
Yes. Okay. So that leads me into my first question. Before we dive into the science, I'm curious to know what led you to this passion for understanding emotions and how better to regulate them.
Thank you for the question, Corey. My blind spots led me to this passion. My failures, my pains, and my banging my head against a wall that I didn't even have a name for. And which was nothing other than being raised in an environment, broadly speaking, family, but also more broadly cultural, where emotions, it wasn't really what we needed to talk about. We needed to talk about goals. We needed to talk about tasks. We needed to talk about performance. We needed to talk about what was very important to other people. And for very good reasons, I have been blessed by truly a wonderful childhood, incredible teachers, incredible parents, lots of incredible good stuff. But just who was Nicolo and what was their particular needs and emotions, stuff that wasn't just the center of the conversation for much. It's not that I was neglected in the least. I was showered with love and attention. But at the end of the day, it was more about, right, okay, now things need to happen. You need to perform in a certain way, do certain things. And I think this is very common, I believe. But it was definitely present for me also as a highly sensitive person. We can open that topic later if you want. Basically, somebody who tends to have pretty intense feelings and quite strong emotional reaction, just as a way of my makeup. It created this weird situation where I would be feeling things quite deeply and strongly, but I wouldn't be able to really feel them anymore. And so it's almost like as if all the emotional world had been a little bit kind of shut down under the neck, become somebody very logical, very rational, pretty high functioning in many areas, done my violin conservatory studies at the same time as doing my university studies and excelling in both. So all those kind of externally oriented type of achieving things. And inside, feeling more and more disconnected, feeling like I didn't have words for what the hell I was doing, and then starting to fall apart in a bunch of areas of my life. Relationships was the first and most obvious one, whereby there were these things that girlfriend seemed to want at some point from me, like saying I love you. And I just wasn't sure what actually they were referring to. It made sense, but I really didn't know what they were talking about. Now I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much. So, and then you can see, right, the path, the downward path from there, where the next thing that breaks down predictably is your body, like physical injuries, not taking care of yourself very well, and then eventually even your career, which at the beginning seemed to be what everything was being optimized around. But in the end of the day, also that reveals itself as, well, I don't actually know what I'm doing anymore and why I'm really doing, and if I really want to do it. But then what? Well, what the hell am I going with my whole life, right? And so at this point, this kind of, I don't know what are emotions. I don't really care about them. It's not what's important. Create a kind of a systemic breakdown that made for some really wonderful discoveries.
Really appreciate you bringing us there and giving us that background. You know, and it's amazing to me because I know you as such a Renaissance man. You know, I didn't even mention that you're an accomplished musician, right? So all of those abilities, all of those things that you bring, and I'm having trouble recalling where the quote comes from, but to paraphrase it, it's something about, you know, it was a fictional book that was written where they said, you know, Mr. So and so lived at some distance from his body, right? And I wonder if that resonates with you. This idea that you had all these emotions, but for some reason or another, you were separated from them.
100%.
Does
In
that
fact,
Yeah.
yeah, I recall at some point I realized I needed to do some kind of personal journey into psychotherapy, and so I got myself a therapist. And one of the questions that she was asking me that at the time was completely making no sense, as was making me really irritated, was, okay, but how does it feel in your body? What are you feeling in your body? And just, what the hell are you talking about? I'm sitting my bum on the chair, and that's about it, right? And it's hilarious because
Right.
that's probably one of the questions that I ask more frequently these days
Right.
to anybody who crosses my path
Right.
for whatever reason, right? But totally, right, lost that that connection. But great news, right? It was really gone for me, and I really picked it back up. And so it's a wonderful thing how malleable this journey is. The fact that you have been a certain way up to your 20, 25, 30, 35, 55 doesn't mean anything. The moment you decide, okay, I'm going to learn this, we're going to talk about how that happens maybe later, but so much opportunity.
Hence why we're both coaches.
Ah,
Right?
right.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that, Nicolo. One of the things that I wanted to get into is there's a lot of sort of popularized myths about emotions. For instance, that we're born with certain emotional tendencies that are like hardwired into our brains, or that emotions come from the ancient or the mammalian or the reptilian brain. It's completely incoherent to me, by the way, so maybe you can touch on that in a second. For coaches, these myths are concerning because it implies that emotional patterns or emotional regulation can't be changed. So can you tell us a little bit more about maybe how these myths started, but more importantly, maybe dispel them for us?
Yeah. Thank you. This is a huge topic. So let's start by acknowledging and honoring the truth or the grain of truth that there is in some of these notions, so that then we can clarify what is not. So it is absolutely true that we are born with differences among each other in terms of some certain rather basic feature of our makeup, partly encoded in our in our genes. And one example of that is our arousal level, or how responsive our system is in generating arousal to certain stimulus. Arousal means how much activated you get by certain events. In terms of maybe how much your heart rate increases, or how much your blood pressure goes up, how much you feel like something is important is happening. So we do see differences at birth between individuals. Some people, if you give them the exact same clap of a hand, even at birth, you will see certain babies respond more, other baby responds a little bit less. Okay, and these differences do map onto certain longer-term development qualities. To mention one, I mentioned myself being a highly sensitive person. Well, that has one of its roots in differences in your arousal system, meaning people who are, relatively speaking, higher on the sensitivity spectrum tends to have a little bit stronger arousal responses in the way I, for example, defined them earlier compared to other people. And so there are differences in people in the way they are wired, and some of these differences have some connection to emotions. However, and that's where basically the grain of truth ends, and now we need to start put down some real important distinctions. Emotions are not arousal. Joy, love, excitement, suffering, sadness, hope, etc. That's not the same as heart rate and blood pressure, as we're going to maybe discover later in this call. There are universes of kind of order of magnitude of differences and intermediate steps between your heart beating a little faster and you feeling certain emotion. These are not the same thing. So the fact that we do have basic differences in some of our wiring, including certain aspects of our physiology related to arousal, doesn't equate we have hardwired differences in our emotions, because emotions are incredibly more nuanced, complex, psychological and social construct that only very loosely map onto those very, very basic physiologies. And so let's now dive into some of the most kind of glaring and surprisingly widespread misconceptions. One is the one that you were referring to earlier, the fact that some people say, lots of people say, emotions are generated by this kind of mammalian, ancient part of our brain, which in the very popular and completely neuroscientifically misguided notion of the triune brain, the mammalian brain would be the middle of a sandwich, whereby the bottom of it is the so-called reptilian brain, which is supposedly responsible for our instinctual, survival-oriented responses, sex, hunger, basic movements. Then on top of it, you would have this kind of centerpiece, which is responsible for emotions, the mammalian brain. And then on top of that, almost like the icing on top of a cake, you would have this more recent, more advanced, more evolved, and truly, quote, 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 it's all BS, truly human layer, which is the neocortex, or whatever you want to call it, which is responsible supposedly for rationality and for our more evolved capacity. Okay, and so in this kind of mythical model, it's they literally say there is a human, and there is a monkey, and then there is a lizard, and our life is basically construed as or even our development and our growth is construed as a way to try and harmonize these forces so that we can evolve from a scenario where maybe the lizard or the monkey are running the show to a scenario where hopefully the human is running the show, or maybe you could say maybe there is a kind of some useful integration such that we can be both a beast and a person in a kind of a harmonious way. And all of this, Corey, it's ridiculous when you look at it from a anatomical and neuroscientific perspective. I'm going to share in a moment why. But before we kind of tear it down, let's speak about why this myth has some utility, some value, because I don't want to throw out the baby with the water.
Yeah.
We as humans need stories. We need metaphors. We need simple ways of making sense of reality that we can use to guide ourselves. And so this idea, which if you track it back, it goes all the way back to Plato and the metaphor of the charioteers with the two horses, one of the emotion and then the rational. These are tools, these metaphors, these stories are useful tools that we can sometimes employ to navigate reality and to try and direct our choices, our behaviors, be reminded of maybe important learning that we want to be able to use in the current moment. And so I don't have anything wrong with using metaphors and using stories and myth to try and make sense of reality. Sometimes it's incredibly useful and practical to have them, okay?
Right.
However, that doesn't mean that that is an accurate representation of an underlying reality, okay? There is always a gap between the map and the territory. And the map is a useful tool, and it's not the territory. And so when we look at how the brain is actually wired, well, the story is completely different, is quite a bit more complex. And so in a way, it's a little bit harder to hold in your mind and to grasp. We're going to do our best to kind of share it with you today in a kind of a synthetic form. But this is just to say that the reality is different. The metaphor can still be useful as long as we remember that they are metaphor and we remain open to the more literal understanding of what is happening and not confuse the two. Because the moment we start to buy into the story that I have an inner beast that I need to somehow tame using my rational mind, and I believe that that's actually what's going on, the number of distortions and ridiculous nonsense that can come out of this, it's infinite. And you will see it today, just to give an example, in the way many companies are trying and spectacularly failing at developing artificial intelligence models to try and make robots emotional and interact with humans in an emotionally pertinent way. They have a very long way to go, and that work is based on incredibly flawed premises, which is our premises based on what I just described. And you can see these attempts like really falling short in pretty spectacular ways. And you see, how can this suck so much? We have all this money, we have all this potential, we have all this technical know-how, yes, but you're using an understanding of emotion that is fundamentally metaphorically and not actually the way it really works. And then you're coming to conclusions that are dramatically wrong. And you can see this playing out in many other ways. I'll just mention one before you tell me where you want to go next. The way the judicial system is set up, the way emotions are understood in court, is often informed by these theories. And these theories imply that you can, for example, you should be able to accurately detect an emotion with a certain level of precision as an outsider. And if you believe that, then as a judge, you can buy into the belief that you can accurately tell if somebody is genuinely remorseful or not. And this can make the difference between sending them to death sentence or not.
Right.
So there are massively important decisions that judges, police personnel, doctors, parents, all of us make on a daily basis that have very important implication, and that can be confounded by a kind of a misunderstood way of understanding the brain. So from here, I can tell a little bit about why that myth is actually a myth and how it works in reality, or we can take it somewhere else. Where you want to go, Corey?
Well, let's take it somewhere else, because I want to circle back to something that you said about the artificial intelligence and how it's based on false premises. I found that really fascinating. I hadn't planned to talk about this, but so I constantly hear AI is, building generatively, and it's in 10 years it's going to be smarter than the smartest person on earth and all these things. The distinction that I'd make is, at the beginning I heard a lot of talk about emotion, and now I don't. Now I hear a lot of talk about intelligence and knowledge, but not the emotion piece. And I wonder if that somehow connects with what you're saying, that they haven't figured that piece out because it's based on false premises.
Yeah. I'm not an insider in any major technology company, so you and I right now are making inferences, but I can guarantee you that the major players are going down the wrong path, because I follow the people who are trying to help them steer, and they say, no, they are not getting it. And the whole, one of the premises, right, is that they are using emotions as something that can be basically indexed in terms of their fingerprints. Basic components like anger is made of this kind of furrowing your brows, and a certain way of moving your cheeks, and a certain way of making your voice sound a certain way, and then your heart rate, right? And then we can build an AI that does that. And it's going to fail, because that's actually not how anger works at all. And so it's going to fail spectacularly. It's going to sound completely fake, completely unable to attune to the reality of an interaction. And so knowing that this is, however, what they are trying to do, because that's where the mainstream science of emotion is still anchored in, I have no surprise that what you're telling me, that we're not talking a lot about AI and emotions, because it's going to take a while. And in a way, it's an impossible endeavor, because to really get at emotions in the way humans have, you need to have a body like humans have. You can't have an actual emotion without a body attached. Okay, and maybe we're going to talk about that later, but here is a...
we'll get into that science.
And this doesn't mean that AI cannot
I cut you off there.
And this doesn't mean that AI cannot do incredible things. Like, I am absolutely pro technology. I am all for developing great ways of intelligence. And what I believe maybe we need is not to call certain things with the wrong label. Like, for example, let's not call them emotions. Let's call what AI do something else, which can be useful as we define it in whatever way we realize we need to define it, so that it's going to be useful for what it's going to meant to be useful, and we're not going to try to use it for something that is going to be a guaranteed failure. Back to you.
Like a robo-emotion?
That could be an initial distinction, right? Or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. And we're going to dive into the science very, very soon, I think, because I'm going to ask you a question which I think is going to lead you into those answers. Complex, but stick with us, because this stuff is really, really important. So, one of the myths that I've heard you debunk in the past is that emotions are triggered by internal or external events. And I want to say that seems to make sense to me at first glance. So I'll give you an example. I'm driving in my car and somebody cuts me off, potentially endangering me, maybe I have my daughter in the car, it seems natural that I might have an emotional reaction to this, that I'm triggered by that. Now, you've explained in the past that's not actually how it works. Can you explain what's actually happening inside me in that moment?
Yeah. So I'll put it in just one single sentence and then we'll unpack forever. What's actually happening
Sure.
is that instead of reacting with an emotion, your brain is creating an experience of that moment and is creating an emotion based on a prediction that he had already made and that is then validated based on reality. So reality only happens in our brain after the brain has already run an internal prediction of what's happening and then uses the information from the senses to validate. And the whole process, the whole cascade that comes from the initial issuing of the prediction to the then match or adjustment with the intersection of reality is what we call an emotion. So the emotion comes before the event, during the event, after the event. It's a process that can't be separated from the predictive processes that the brain is always running as a way to operate itself and operate the body as it goes. And so, and the beauty of this and the crazy part about this is that all of this happens outside of your awareness, is designed to happen outside of your awareness such that we subjectively experience exactly what you described. It seems like I'm having an emotion as triggered as a reaction to something that happened externally. Whereas when you go under the hood and look at how the brain is actually running the whole pipeline, the brain is constantly running a simulation of the world, is anticipating the needs of the body and anticipating the information from the senses as they have occurred in the past, is also anticipating certain feeling quality, feeling like arousal, pleasant, unpleasant, and is constantly kind of creating this massive broadcast of prediction into loops that then trickle down to the ears, to the eyes, to the mouth, to the skin, where bits and pieces of very, very noisy actual data is captured and matched against that prediction. And then the prediction is kind of updated backwards up the chain. And the emotion is one of the way in which we can describe the whole process of creating the prediction and then updating it based on sensory reality. How is that as a beginning?
So, well, it's absolutely fascinating, first of all. And a quick question that I have for you is that system, that predictive sort of loop that you described, is that an evolutionary thing that we developed to help us survive? Maybe to be social? Or is that involved in that at all? Is that why we do that?
Okay, so
Yeah.
yes, but let's just unpack your beautiful question. Before we get to the social, let's tackle just the first part, as you said it. Is this something that helps us survive? Yes, 100%. And there are a number of reasons for that. You have to consider that the input that is coming from our actual senses, the kind of representation of reality that we would, quote, react to, that input is incredibly noisy. It's a jumble. It's a mess. It's this kind of very noisy currents that are coming from this little sensor inside our ears, inside our eyes, inside our skin. And so there is this jumble of noise basically incoming. And there is no way that you could actually just parse that if you didn't already have an assumption about what it is. You would have to even be able to process something like the taste of your coffee and the experience of lifting the coffee cup and bringing to your eyes. There is no way you would be able to do that movement and experience the coffee if your body wasn't already able to predict what is it like to do that movement and what is it like to have the coffee. It would be just it would take you 1 year probably of sitting there and trying to do the movement and then try to taste the coffee. It would take an incredible long time, and it would be very, very noisy. And you would get confused, and you would get a tremendous amount of false positive and missed targets because of how noisy.
Information overload,
noise overload, and redundancy of the input, ambiguity about the source of the input. Also figure this, your brain is locked inside the skull. It doesn't actually have the brain itself doesn't have actually access to the coffee. It only has access to a bunch of little currents of electricity that are 25, maybe more steps removed from the coffee, and that arrive at the same time as a gazillion other currents of electricity. So the brain has to make guesses. And for these guesses to arrive at a sufficiently smooth, fast timing, these guesses have to come before the experience itself, so that you can operate under the illusion that life is this kind of very smooth flow into a reality that seems to happen in real time. The truth couldn't be further from the thing that is actually created. It's a gigantic half illusion, half matching process that is constantly created, and that gives us, in relatively predictable situation, the ability to function with this kind of very smooth way. And sometimes it doesn't work, right? And sometimes we get it wrong, and then all sort of funny situation happens. And of course you can see children, right? Children have to build all of that to a large extent from scratch, not completely from scratch, but a large extent from scratch. And so that is what it means to learn. It means to learn how to seamlessly generate prediction about what the body is going to feel like, what movement is going to be needed, what sensory information is going to be like, and then catch just enough of those noisy signals to be able to probabilistically, statistically say, okay, this is probably coffee. And if I move my hand in this way that I have done in the past, I'm with 90% accuracy going to hit the cup in the correct spot, right? And all of this happens below consciousness.
Right. So in a layman's term, then, this predictive loop, this ultimate source of the emotion, is based on an experience and how we make sense of that experience. Why the baby has so much to learn is because they don't have those experience built in. They haven't, I don't know, categorized them or classified them or organized them in some way.
Yep.
Is that what you're saying here? Yeah, okay.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Okay, this is fascinating. Yeah, this is fascinating. So, I'm in my car, I'm driving, somebody cuts me off.
Yeah.
I can tell you, and you've probably driven with me, so you know this to be true. I'm going to get mad at that guy that cut me off, okay? So, am I getting mad at him not so much because of the sensory experience coming in, but because I've, through experience, classified that as a bad thing?
Mm-hmm. So, basically...
Is that right?
That's right. And because you are interpreting a number of signals that are happening inside and outside of you, you're interpreting them, categorizing them in a certain way that you think is going to be helpful to operate effectively in that scenario. Okay, because the purpose of the brain
Right.
is not to just sit there and give meaning to reality and make sense of reality. It's kind of a little bit silly when we talk about it in terms. The purpose of the brain is to do stuff, is to make sure that your body stays alive and that is able to cope in terms of glucose and in terms of interaction with the environment and in terms of many other aspects of it, that is able to interact effectively with the environment so that it's going to stay alive. And so you're having a bunch of physiological reaction, you're having a bunch of sensory stuff happening, you're having a bunch of thoughts, and you're using the notion of anger as a way to package that whole prediction that you're making in that moment in a way that in that moment seems to be useful. And it's quite easy to imagine how that can be useful, at least in a kind of a short-sighted term, right? I'm gonna get angry and I'm gonna tell him off, right? And this is gonna...
Well, hopefully I don't go that far.
I know. I'm not saying that it always really works, right?
Yeah. So, okay, so that brings me to a question about fear.
Mm-hmm.
Because the car cutting me off, it started as a fear.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh my God, I'm gonna get hit. Maybe my daughter's gonna be hurt.
Right.
How do you distinguish between the fear that comes from a situation like that, or a bear chasing you, and the fear that a lot of clients as a coach that I experience, where they're fearful that their business isn't going to work,
Mm-hmm.
or they're fearful that they're not going to reach the next stage. Like, both are a kind of fear,
Mm-hmm.
but one is developed to help us fight or flight survive,
Mm-hmm.
and the other is something very different.
Mm-hmm.
Am I jumping too far ahead right here, or is this making sense to the discussion right now?
Let's go. That's beautiful. So one way we could talk about it, you're talking about the difference between fear and anxiety, right? Whereby we talk about fear as
Right.
something that involves your immediate survival, and anxiety, it's a more future-oriented emotion. Nothing is threatening you right this moment, but there might be things that you need to pay attention about in the future that could potentially be threatening. Now, instead of going deeper into the distinction between fear and anxiety, what I really want to point out here, because it's going to directly map onto what I was talking about earlier, is notice what I just did. I used two emotion words to basically capture a set of prediction and categorize them into different set of meanings and different sets of action. So if I categorize something,
And I understood them.
right? And you understand them because you and I roughly belong to the same cultural framework and background. And so we are able to use words such as fear and anxiety and present survival versus future possibility in a way that more or less we have concepts that approximately match each other. They probably don't match exactly, but they match enough that you and I are in this experience of we're understanding each other, okay? So this is quintessential to how emotions are made as opposed to triggered. What we're talking about here really is in either of the situation, the car accident or the client thinking about whether their business is going to do well or not, what you're having a bunch of physical reaction, you're having certain levels of arousal, you have a certain level of pleasant unpleasantness of the situation, you're having some kind of sensory stimulation that you're predicting and then validating, like the loud bang in the case of the car crash versus no loud bang, just nothing happening in the case of the client thinking about their future. You have a certain series of thought pattern that are running in your mind. And now socially, as an exquisitely social kind of acculturation and agreement, we choose to call certain ensembles of experiences fear, and we make sense of them, we attach them a meaning of as immediate, urgent response needed for survival, and we label others anxiety. Okay, And now we have basically these two tools, these two words that map onto a very complex array of scenarios with lots of variations, but also some commonalities. And we can use them to orient ourselves and orient each other in a shared reality framework. And so emotions, what they really are, they are socially constructed ways of categorizing many layers of your experience so that you can get a better sense of what you need to do, what you need to pay attention to, so that you can better communicate with others, so you can better influence others, and so that you can regulate your body effectively, right? These are very complex functions, and having a very up the hierarchy level tool that enables you to downstream take care of all of these functions in a coherent way is amazing. It's basically like having, I don't know, it's like having an operating system, right? That allows you to run many programs at the same time and make them go together in a way that enables you to get a certain task done. Or maybe let's call it maybe a software, right? You could say fear could be the equivalent of a word processor. It helps you do a certain thing. Anxiety could be the equivalent of a different kind of software, maybe a spreadsheet. It enables you to do a different kind of things. And underneath there is a tremendous amount of compute. And this is what basically emotions are useful for. And one last thing I want to say is that the social construction of all of it is fundamental. If we travel to a different culture, people will create different categories. They will slice up reality in slightly different ways, or sometimes completely different ways, because there is no one way or another to slice reality and to put together different experiences. It a lot depends on the kind of challenges that we frequently face and how putting together different aspects of our experiences help us face our challenges. For example, the notion of anxiety is very useful in our current Western world where we try to launch businesses and we don't know if they're going to work or not, right? It's a very important notion. It may be a completely irrelevant notion 100,000 years ago, living in the savannah, people probably had no notion of anxiety. I'm making this up, right? Maybe I don't know. I have no clue what it was like, but you can follow my imagination here.
Yeah.
Because it was not just a thing to put together as an experience and to talk about and to try and coach each other around. There were other things, other emotions probably that were much more important for them that we have not discovered or lost or currently not collectively constructing and working with. Make sense?
It does, and it's fascinating. And I just want to check in with you. So emotions are part of a predictive cycle that we use to survive and live and communicate and influence and all of those things. And emotions are socially constructed to some extent. We both know what we mean by anger, etc. That does not sound like a brain sandwich where the reptilian brain is the source of this. This sounds like something incredibly complex. And in addition, you haven't even talked about, you alluded to, but you haven't even talked about a statement that you made earlier, which was about the brain we can't feel emotions without a body. So there's something going on there too between the brain and the body. I mean, we could talk about this for 10 days, 100 days, right? Like, this is amazing stuff, right? So can you sort of bring that piece into this a little bit?
Let me start with the first point, because this is exactly the right time, Corey. Thank you for your sensitivity to bring back the whole triune reptilian brain kind of stuff. So I want to reinforce what you said and unpack a little bit. Exactly. Like, I hope everybody listening to this is getting the idea, oh, wow, emotions are this very complex thing. Yes, precisely. And to think about it as, oh, this is what lizards do. I hope that we can start to laugh about it now,
Yeah.
right? And we should, because here is the thing. It is true that if you were really to envision the brain as a sandwich, there is some part in the middle which has similarities superficially. When you look at the anatomy of it superficially, there are similarities, kind of very coarse, high-level anatomical similarities to the way that in middle part of the brain, you can call it the limbic system if you want, looks in previous animals. And so because then it looks similar in its shape, the kind of the 2 cents silly psychology says, okay, well, it does the same thing. And then the emotion for the lizard are the same as the emotion for the human. And what that misses is that the brain doesn't operate as a separate series of legacy hardware, somewhat squished one into the other. We're talking about millions of years of evolution, guys. Let's be serious. Like anything that makes it to the next piece of the evolution chain has been deeply tested and rewired so that it's maximally useful and practical and coherent with the rest of the system. So our human quote, 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 limbic brain has nothing ancient. It's a completely redesigned piece of neural magical technology that is completely embedded and completely participating with everything else in the brain. And so the fact that we have parts of our brains that other animals don't seem to have, like a more developed prefrontal cortex, doesn't only mean that we have a new part of the brain, but it means that everything else is different. Because all of these pieces are connected and the brain works as a whole, not in kind of separated, siloed blocks. Mm-hmm. And so it may look superficially similar to other parts of the brain that other animals have, but the way it functions and what it does and how it does what it do, it's completely different. For example, this kind of way in which we can process our bodily signals and generate prediction about the future using socially constructed categories of anger and fear and anxiety, which are very basically equivalent, functionally equivalent to other categories that we socially construct, such as money and vehicles. And I'm sorry, guys, but also things like God and religion and spirituality. Like these are all ways that we have created as humans to talk about stuff that matters to us and that make a big difference to us. And we use our limbic, so-called brain, as well as every other part of the brain, to try and make sense of this and create predictions around those things. And so whether you want to call it lizard, I don't know. I mean, at this point, it just becomes a matter of the storytelling device that you want to use depending on the purpose, right? My 4-year-old would have a blast from knowing that, after all, he does have a dinosaur inside his brain, right? So if that helps you feel like your dinosaur inside, go for it, right? Again, the power of metaphors is real, but then the way the brain works, it's a different thing. As far as the second point you raised, Corey, the body, I think we can tackle that in a relatively brief way by saying that the regulation of your body function, as far as things like how much glucose do I have in your blood, what kind of hormones are running, what kind of pressure do we need to keep in the arteries so that you can meet the requirements of every moment as it comes. That is the start point and the end point of every single loop that we can call emotion, or that we can call thought, or that we can call interaction, or that we call whatever kind of experience you want to talk about. even the more sublime and abstract and semi-intellectual, it all starts with your brain trying to figure out, okay, how much glucose do I anticipate I will need next based on what's going on here? And then running the whole loop and trying to adjust the levels so that it matches that. And so you can't conceive of anything that we call human, including emotion, without understanding it as completely wired into the physiology that emotion or the thought or that interaction is eventually trying to regulate, and even before it tried to regulate is primarily stemming from at the beginning and at the end of the loop. So the fact that we, again, have a heart that pumps blood, we have lungs that need oxygen, that certain molecules regulate our ability to function, that is the beginning and the end of every single thought, emotion, notion that you can contemplate in what you call your mind. And there is no way to really tease these two apart, because that's just not what the reality of the wiring is. Make sense?
In other words, there is no, and in other words, there is no separation of mind and body for both physiologically, but in all practical purposes. Then, the other thing.
Can I?
Sorry, go ahead.
Right. Always be careful when we go into this kind of territory. There is no separation of mind and body with respect to the wiring. That doesn't mean that the notion of mind and body as two things may not have, in some cultures, in some kind of conversation, for some purposes, doesn't mean that it doesn't have any utility. We can collect a bunch of experiences and decide to call them mind, and we can collect a bunch of other experiences that between a bunch of people in the same culture occur as different and relevant to different purposes and call them body. And now we can talk about something that we maybe are going to find useful to talk about and to discern, depending on the particular type of relationship and type of goals that collectively we are trying to meet.
Yeah, and thank you for adding the nuance to that. I think what I'm trying to say is, we come from a tradition of, Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, this sort of artificial separation when you want to talk about metaphors of mind and body, and it just doesn't work that way, right?
That's it.
We are all one, yeah. So that's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
So getting back to what you said about what is really an incredibly complex and beautiful network that plays out as this predictive system, right? Why are we then, I guess, so bad at emotional regulation? And here is why I want to pivot to practical steps that we can take to change those sort of habitual emotional patterns. And where I'd like to maybe frame this around is, I love what you've talked about in the past. I've seen you speak in the past about emotional granularity and emotional recategorization. If that serves you, if that's useful in this conversation, please go there. If you want to go somewhere else, please go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. But I found both those things interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
And mainly what I want the people to walk away with is, okay, so we've learned all this. What the heck do we do with it? And how do I not get mad at the guy that cuts me off in the car? Okay?
Phenomenal.
That's really what this comes down to.
Right. The great takeaway is, let's go out on the highway after this and feel just infinite love and gratitude for the guy who is cutting off in traffic. No, that's not what we're going.
Perfect. Hello, my friends. So this marks the end of part 1 of my fascinating conversation with Nicolo Bernardi. Thanks to Nicolo, we understand the science behind emotions and how they are made. In part 2, which will release in the following week, we're going to dive into what the heck we do with this knowledge. Nicolo will discuss practices that he recommends for getting better at emotion regulation. In other words, to build a new kind of emotional framework that serves you rather than works against you. He'll introduce us to practices that emerge from the science that he explained in part one about how the brain makes emotions. If you're interested in getting to the next level in your career or business, consider booking a free consultation with me at castleroadcoaching.com. The link will be in the episode notes. Be well and happy, and I'll see you next week.